Right, so here's something quite remarkable that barely anyone talks about. Every single year, Prince William wakes up considerably wealthier than he was when he went to bed. Not because of anything he's done, not because he's built a business or invested wisely, or even shown up to work in any conventional sense. Rather, there's an ancient rule, one that's been quietly operating since the 1300s, that simply hands him millions of pounds, year after year, with barely a sound. And the truly fascinating part, it involves dead people. Specifically, dead people who've died in rather unfortunate circumstances. No will, no family, no one to claim what they've left behind. Before we go any further, if you're interested in the kind of in-depth royal family analysis that goes beyond the headlines, I'd genuinely appreciate it if you subscribed. It really does help, and it means you won't miss these deeper conversations. Right then, let's talk about how an accidental death, a missing will, and a 14th century legal document can turn a member of the royal family into the wealthiest landowner in Britain. The numbers alone are striking. In the financial year 2025-26, Prince William received a private income of £21.6 million from the Duchy of Cornwall. That's not his salary, that's not payment for appearances or patronages, that's not an investment return, that's simply the annual income that flows to him because of who he is and the position he holds. To put that in perspective, the average British household earns around £33,000 a year. William receives the equivalent of what 650 families earn in a single year, just because the law says he's entitled to it. Now, most of that income comes from the obvious sources, the vast property portfolio, agricultural land and commercial ventures that the duchy owns. But here's where it gets genuinely intriguing. A portion of that remarkable sum comes from something called Bona Vacantia. It's Latin for vacant goods, and it refers to assets that have essentially been abandoned by the living. When someone in the jurisdiction of the Duchy of Cornwall dies without leaving a will and without any identifiable relatives who would normally inherit, the law steps in. And the law in this case says that those unclaimed estates, those forgotten properties, those abandoned possessions, they belong to the Duke of Cornwall. They belong to William. Let that sink in for a moment. There's a mechanism built into centuries of British law that means properties regularly end up in Prince William's hands simply because the people who owned them died alone or died without making their wishes known, or their families simply couldn't be traced. It's not something he's lobbying for, it's not something he's personally orchestrating, it's simply the law, and it's been the law before Shakespeare was writing his plays. Now, before anyone gets the impression that William is a 21st century robber baron profiting from tragedy and neglect, there's an important detail. The duchy's official position is clear. After discretionary payments are made, all monies from Bona Vacantia are donated to charity. So technically, while the mechanism funnels these abandoned estates through William, and technically they're part of his wealth portfolio, the actual benefit is supposed to pass to charitable causes. That's the theory, that's what's officially stated. But you can already sense the layers of this story, can't you? Because even understanding where this money goes, the fundamental mechanism is quite extraordinary. To properly understand how this works, we need to step back into history. Medieval England wasn't a place of perfect record-keeping or efficient inheritance procedures. When someone died, particularly someone without connections or wealth or an organized family, figuring out what happened to their property was often complicated. So there needed to be a legal mechanism to handle these situations. Enter Bona Vacantia, a principle that said unclaimed property ultimately reverted to the Crown.
The Crown had to administer it. The Crown had responsibility for it. But here's where it becomes specifically significant for the Duchy of Cornwall. In 1337, when the duchy was established as an entity, when Edward, the Black Prince, was given control of this vast portfolio, a charter was issued that gave the Duke of Cornwall specific authority over Bona Vacantia within the duchy's geographical jurisdiction. That's over 680 years ago, and that ancient charter remains in effect today. When you think about how much law has changed, how utterly different modern Britain is from medieval Britain, the fact that this particular rule is still operating essentially unchanged is rather remarkable. So what exactly is the Duchy of Cornwall? It's not some quaint historical relic that exists mainly in books and official ceremonies. It's one of the largest property portfolios in Britain. We're talking about 67,000 acres of Dartmoor. We're talking about the Oval Cricket Ground in London. We're talking about property and land across 23 different counties in England and Wales. The duchy currently generates an enormous income stream, and it makes Prince William the single largest private landowner in Britain. Not just the wealthiest, the largest in terms of acreage and property holdings. When you walk across certain parts of the English countryside, you're potentially walking across William's land. And all of this, the entire portfolio, comes with the right to receive unclaimed estates within its boundaries. So you can imagine that over centuries, and particularly in modern times where record-keeping is meticulous and you can track properties far more effectively, there are a regular stream of intestate deaths occurring within this jurisdiction. People die. They didn't write a will. They had no relatives that anyone could find. And the property, the house, whatever they left behind, becomes Bona Vacantia. It becomes vacant goods. It becomes part of the Duke's income. Here's what makes this genuinely complex from a modern perspective. We're living in an era where the royal family, for the first time in their history, is being asked to account for their wealth. King Charles made history relatively recently by publishing his tax bill. For the first time, the public saw exactly how much tax the monarch was paying. In the financial year 2024-25, it was £12.9 million. He paid £11.7 million the previous year. For the first time ever, we saw concrete numbers. And what's notable is that the public learned that the king is actually paying substantial tax, even if the arrangements are somewhat different from what ordinary citizens experience. Prince William, following his father's example, published his tax bill as well. In 2025-26, he paid £7.76 million in tax. That's the first time William has made this public. So we now know that on an income of approximately £21.6 million, after tax and various other considerations, his net income is somewhere in the region of £13.8 million. Still an extraordinary sum, you understand, but at least it's transparent. At least people can see it and judge it for themselves. Yet transparency, while valuable, doesn't necessarily eliminate the underlying peculiarity of the situation. The mechanism that generates this wealth remains fundamentally unchanged from its medieval origins. We have a 44-year-old man who, by virtue of an inheritance that traces back through his family line, receives millions of pounds annually from a portfolio that includes properties abandoned by deceased citizens who had no one to claim them. There's something almost Dickensian about it, isn't there? If you were to pitch this as a fictional scenario, a wealthy aristocrat inheriting houses from dead people who had no one to claim them, it would sound like a plot from a Victorian novel. But what makes this story genuinely interesting isn't just the bare mechanism. It's what it says about how Britain's institutions work, about how ancient precedent intersects with modern wealth, and about how the constitutional arrangements that were established centuries ago continue to generate tangible, enormous financial benefits for the people at the top of the hierarchy. It's not corruption, it's not theft, it's not anything illegal, but it is a system that has been quietly operating for so long that nobody really questions whether it makes sense anymore.
And this becomes particularly relevant when you consider what happens next. Because William isn't going to be Duke of Cornwall forever. At some point in the future, he'll become king. And when he does, everything changes. Prince George, his eldest son, will automatically become Duke of Cornwall. The charter, established in 1337, is quite specific about this. It states that the Duke of Cornwall is the eldest surviving son of the sovereign and the heir to the throne. So the moment William accedes to the throne, George becomes Duke. Think about that for a moment. George is currently a child, but when he comes of age, when William is king, George will inherit not just a title, but this vast portfolio, this mechanism for receiving unclaimed estates, this annual £21.6 million income stream. He won't have had to do anything to earn it. He won't have made any decisions to deserve it. He'll simply become old enough to inherit it, and the income will be his. And from George, it will eventually pass to his eldest child. The cycle continues. The mechanism perpetuates. Every heir to the throne, going back through centuries of British history and forward into the indefinite future, will have this arrangement. It's not something that gets reformed or updated. It's not something that gets reconsidered every generation. It's simply what happens. There's something worth reflecting on here about constitutional monarchy and hereditary wealth. Britain has chosen to organise itself in a way where certain families, by virtue of their position in the succession, accumulate extraordinary wealth almost automatically. It's not a criticism necessarily, it's simply an observation about how the system works. The mechanisms that generate this wealth are, on their face, designed to serve a purpose. The charter that established the duchy was trying to solve real practical problems in medieval England. The Bona Vacantia principle was trying to ensure that abandoned property didn't simply disappear into legal limbo. But somewhere along the line, these ancient mechanisms became mechanisms for generating private wealth for people at the top of the hierarchy. They became one part of a much larger system that ensures certain families remain extraordinarily wealthy regardless of what they personally contribute to society. And unlike many other sources of wealth, this one isn't transparent. Most of us can see how a CEO generates wealth. They run a company, make decisions, take risks, and profit accordingly. Most of us can understand how an investment banker becomes wealthy. They manage money for clients and take a percentage. But how do you explain to someone earning £30,000 a year that their taxes help fund a system that automatically generates £21.6 million annually for someone who was born into the right family? It's legally sound, it's historically justified, it's constitutionally arranged, but it's genuinely difficult to defend on merit. That said, there's another layer to this story that complicates the narrative somewhat. The Duchy of Cornwall is not purely a personal piggy bank. It has genuine responsibilities. It manages vast estates, it employs people, it maintains properties and land. It generates employment and economic activity. The income that flows to William comes from rent, from agricultural operations, from commercial tenancies, and yes, from Bona Vacantia, but the running of all this requires genuine administration. Furthermore, and this is important, William does pay tax on this income. He's not exempt, he's not skirting around his obligations. He's paying millions of pounds in tax annually. That's not nothing, that's a real contribution to the public purse. King Charles famously established a voluntary tax arrangement where he pays income tax on the income from his private estates, even though monarchs aren't legally required to do so. William follows the same principle. Still, there's a certain circularity to this, isn't there? Money flows to William through inheritance and historical arrangement. William pays tax on that money.
The tax goes to the public purse. But without the initial arrangement, without the mechanism that funnels unclaimed estates and vast property portfolios to him in the first place, there would be no tax to pay. He's not actually earning this money. He's receiving it by virtue of his position. The tax he pays doesn't change that fundamental reality. Here's what's genuinely worth considering as this story continues to unfold. The royal family exists in an era where transparency is becoming expected. Monarchy historically has been built partly on mystery, on the unknown, on the sense that the royal family operates under different rules and according to different principles. But modern citizens, particularly in democracies, tend to prefer institutions that are accountable and understandable. They want to see how money flows. They want to understand who benefits and why. The fact that King Charles published his tax bill and William followed suit suggests that the institution itself recognizes this shift. It's attempting to be more transparent, more open to scrutiny. That's a significant move, but it also puts mechanisms like Bona Vacantia into sharper relief. Because while the tax bill is public, while the income figure is stated,
the underlying mechanism that generates the wealth in the first place remains largely unexamined. Most people don't know about Bona Vacantia. Most people aren't aware that properties abandoned by people who die without heirs automatically become part of the Duke of Cornwall's portfolio. Most people don't understand that this has been happening continuously for nearly 700 years. It's not a secret exactly, it's published on the Duchy's website, but it's obscure, it's hidden in plain sight. It requires a certain amount of research to uncover. And that, I think, is what makes this story worth telling. Not because there's anything necessarily wrong with it, the law is the law and William is entitled to what the law provides, but because it's a window into how institutional wealth works, how historical arrangements continue to benefit the people at the top, and how it's possible for extraordinary financial arrangements to persist almost unnoticed in a modern democracy, simply because they're old enough and complex enough that most people don't really think about them. When you zoom out and look at the broader picture, what you're seeing is a system that has evolved over centuries to concentrate wealth among a very small group of people. It's legal, it's constitutional, it's defensible on historical grounds, but it's also undeniably a system where someone born into the right family will automatically become extraordinarily wealthy simply by existing and reaching a certain age. That's quite a statement about how Britain is organised, isn't it? The story of Prince William's £21.6 million annual income isn't really a story about William himself. He didn't create this system. He didn't lobby for these advantages. He was simply born into them. The story is actually about institutions, about history, and about how the British system continues to organise itself in ways that concentrate power and wealth among people at the very top of the hierarchy. It's about how ancient legal concepts like Bona Vacantia, originally designed to solve practical medieval problems, continue to generate extraordinary personal wealth in the modern era. And as William prepares for his eventual role as king, and as George prepares unknowingly for his role as Duke of Cornwall, this mechanism will continue operating exactly as it has for nearly 700 years. The properties will continue to be unclaimed, the estates will continue to be abandoned, and the income will continue to flow. Not because anyone is particularly planning it that way, but simply because that's how the system has been set up, and nobody has yet decided to change it. So what do you make of this? Does knowing how this mechanism actually works change your perspective on royal family wealth at all, or do you think it's simply how things have always been and should continue to be? I'd genuinely love to know your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let's have a proper conversation about it. And if you found this exploration of how these institutions actually work interesting, please do subscribe if you haven't already. These deeper dives into how the royal family's wealth and power are actually structured, that's what we do here. There's always another layer to these stories, and I'd be delighted to explore them with you.